This eyesore is gone by Friday, or you'll face daily fines starting at $500. Karen Whitfield slammed the violation notice against my chest, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the paper as she glared at my father's restored 1969 Camaro SS. Actually, Karen, I've spent 15 years investigating insurance fraud for the state. I kept polishing the chrome, my voice steady and calm. And right now, you're exhibiting every behavioral tell of someone running a scam. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. My name is Mike Chen, and I used to hunt down people who thought they were smarter than the system. I'd developed an eye for reading micro-expressions, voice patterns, and the subtle tells that separate honest mistakes from deliberate deception. Karen's overly aggressive approach, her rehearsed speech about community standards, and her refusal to make eye contact while delivering threats, it all screamed guilty conscience. But this wasn't just about some bureaucratic power trip. This Camaro represented everything my father had worked for during his final years. Dad was a Purple Heart recipient who'd come home from Vietnam with shrapnel in his leg and nightmares that lasted decades. When the VA doctors told him he had 6 months to live, he'd spent every remaining day in his garage, restoring this car for the grandson he'd never see graduate high school. Tommy had been 8 when Grandpa passed, but he still remembered every lesson about carburetors and chrome, every story about American muscle cars, and the pride of building something with your own hands. The HOA covenants clearly state no vehicles over 20 years old, Karen continued, her voice rising as Tommy's shoulders slumped beside me. This project car attracts the wrong element to our community. I caught the pause before project car and the way her eyes lingered on my last name on the violation notice. 23 years of marriage to my wife Lisa had taught me to recognize coded language, and Karen's barely concealed bias was as obvious as a neon sign. She wasn't just targeting the car, she was targeting us. Funny thing about those covenants, I said, setting down my polishing cloth and finally making eye contact. I've read every word, and that particular restriction was added just 6 months ago. Curious timing, don't you think? Tommy straightened up beside me, recognizing the tone I used when I was about to dismantle someone's carefully constructed lies. During my fraud investigation career, I'd learned that bullies relied on intimidation because they couldn't survive scrutiny. They counted on their victims being too overwhelmed or under-resourced to fight back effectively. Karen's face flushed red. The board voted unanimously. Did they? I interrupted, pulling out my phone. Because I have a copy of the meeting minutes right here, and it shows only 3 of 7 board members present for that vote. That's not a quorum, Karen, which makes your new rule legally unenforceable. The morning sun caught the Camaro's metallic blue paint, the same color Dad had chosen because it reminded him of the South China Sea on calm days. He'd spent his last Christmas explaining to Tommy how the engine's 396 cubic inches of displacement made it a true SS, how the cowl induction hood wasn't just for show, and how someday this car would be Tommy's connection to a grandfather who'd fought for freedom overseas. This discussion is over, Karen snapped, backing toward her BMW. Friday deadline stands, or you'll be hearing from our attorney. As her car disappeared around the corner, Tommy looked up at me with the same expression he'd worn when the bigger kids tried to steal his lunch money in 6th grade. Dad, are we really going to have to get rid of Grandpa's car? I put my arm around his shoulders and felt the weight of my father's legacy, my son's dreams, and something else. The familiar thrill of a case that was about to crack wide open. Karen Whitfield had just made the mistake of targeting someone who'd spent his career exposing people exactly like her. Where are you watching from? I asked, looking directly into his eyes. Because your old man didn't spend 15 years learning how to take down fraudsters just to roll over for some wannabe dictator with a clipboard. Karen had picked the wrong family to mess with, and she was about to learn exactly what happens when you threaten the things that matter most to someone who knows how to fight back. After Tommy left for school, I grabbed my notebook and decided to test a theory that had been nagging at me since Karen's performance in my driveway. In my fraud investigation days, isolated incidents were rarely isolated. There was always a pattern if you knew where to look. My first stop was the Rodriguez house 3 blocks over, where Maria answered the door with the wary expression of someone who'd been burned by official-looking visitors. When I introduced myself and mentioned Karen Whitfield, her entire demeanor changed. "That woman destroyed our lives," she said, inviting me into her modest living room. "My husband Carlos runs his plumbing business out of our garage, and we've parked his work truck in our driveway for 8 years without a single complaint. Then suddenly, Karen shows up with some new commercial vehicle restriction and threatens daily fines unless we move it." I pulled out my notebook, recognizing the same tactical approach Karen had used on me. What happened next? We couldn't afford to rent commercial parking space, and Carlos couldn't run his business without the truck at home for emergency calls. Maria continued, her voice breaking slightly. "We had to sell and move to a smaller house across town. Lost $15,000 in equity because we needed to sell fast. The calculated cruelty of it made my investigator instincts flare. This wasn't bureaucratic incompetence. This was systematic targeting designed to force specific people out of the neighborhood. My next stop confirmed the pattern. Elderly Mr. and Mrs. Patel had been forced to remove a traditional garden statue that had sat in their front yard for 12 years, suddenly deemed inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. The violation notice had appeared the day after their grandson's loud graduation party. "We tried to fight it," Mrs. Patel explained, her accent thick with emotion. "But the legal fees, at our age, we cannot afford such battles. We removed the statue, and now our garden looks so empty, so American bland." I documented every detail, recognizing the psychological warfare tactics Karen employed. She identified what mattered most to each family, then weaponized HOA rules to attack those exact pressure points. The newlywed Johnsons told the most revealing story yet. Sarah Johnson, still wearing her work scrubs from the hospital, described how Karen had targeted their motorcycle after learning Sarah worked night shifts. She claimed the bike was disturbing the peace when I came home from 12-hour shifts at 2 a.m., Sarah explained. But I was barely idling it, trying to be respectful. The real problem was Karen cornering my husband about how certain professions brought undesirable elements to upscale neighborhoods like ours. The coded language was identical to what she'd used about my project car, attracting the wrong element. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was systematically removing families she deemed unworthy of Willowbrook Estates. "Did she offer any solutions?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Oh yes," Sarah's voice turned bitter. She mentioned how her real estate company specialized in quick sales for motivated sellers and could help us transition to a more suitable community. Real generous, considering she was the one making our lives impossible. Walking through the subdivision streets, I tallied the evidence in my notebook. 7 families in 3 years, all following identical patterns. Sudden rule enforcement, escalating harassment, and convenient real estate solutions provided by Karen's company. She was running a sophisticated operation to manipulate property turnover and control neighborhood demographics. But something else caught my attention as I walked. The houses Karen hadn't targeted. The Williamses had a boat trailer that clearly violated the same vehicle restrictions that had destroyed the Rodriguez family. The Hendersons' front yard was cluttered with lawn equipment that would have triggered aesthetic standards violations for the Patels. Yet none of them had received violation notices. I pulled out my phone and cross-referenced the untouched properties with public records. Every single family Karen had ignored were longtime residents with Anglo names and traditional, suburban presentations. The families she'd targeted represented the community's diversity: Latino, South Asian, working class, mixed-race couples like Lisa and me. Standing in front of the community mailboxes, I realized I wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry HOA president. Karen Whitfield was running an illegal scheme to ethnically cleanse Willowbrook Estates while profiting from the forced property sales. The woman who'd threatened my father's legacy was systematically destroying the American dream for anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of suburban perfection. My phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. "Dad, kids at school heard about the car thing. Can we really keep it?" I looked back at my notebook filled with stories of families forced from their homes, then at my father's Camaro gleaming in our driveway. Karen had made one critical mistake in her calculated campaign of neighborhood manipulation. She'd targeted someone with the skills and experience to expose her entire operation. I was walking off my frustration around the community pond that evening, my notebook heavy with evidence of Karen's systematic targeting, when I spotted Janet Morrison sitting alone on the wooden bench near the gazebo. Her shoulders were hunched forward, and she kept glancing toward Karen's house across the water like she expected to be caught doing something wrong. Janet had always struck me as one of the reasonable board members, a retired English teacher who'd moved to Willowbrook Estates after her husband passed, looking for a quiet place to tend her garden and volunteer at the library. But as I approached, I noticed her hands were trembling slightly as she clutched a manila folder against her chest. "Evening, Janet," I said, settling onto the bench beside her. "Beautiful sunset tonight." She startled like I'd caught her stealing, then forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, hello, Mike. Yes, it's lovely." Her voice carried the careful tone of someone choosing every word deliberately. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the ducks glide across the pond's surface while the setting sun painted everything golden. But Janet's body language screamed internal conflict, her foot tapping nervously against the ground, her grip tightening on that folder, her eyes darting between me and Karen's house like she was calculating distances. "I heard about the violation notice," she finally said, her teacher's instincts apparently winning some internal battle. "About your father's car." The way she said it, soft, almost apologetic, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't the voice of someone who supported Karen's aggressive tactics. "Yeah, it's been an interesting day," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Learned a lot about our community's recent history." Janet's shoulders sagged, and she pressed the folder tighter against her chest. "Mike, I need you to know that not everyone on the board agrees with how things have been handled lately." The admission seemed to cost her something. Her hands were definitely shaking now, and she kept glancing toward Karen's house like she expected surveillance cameras trained on our conversation. "It must be difficult," I said gently, "being caught between doing what's right and maintaining board unity." That broke something loose in her. "I've been documenting things," she whispered, leaning closer to me. "Taking notes during meetings, keeping copies of decisions that felt wrong. But I'm just a retired English teacher, Mike. I don't understand the legal implications of what I'm seeing." Her confession hung in the air between us like a lifeline I hadn't expected. Janet Morrison, mild-mannered former educator who baked cookies for new neighbors, had been conducting her own internal investigation. "What kind of things?" I asked, my investigator instincts fully engaged. She glanced around nervously, then opened the folder just enough for me to glimpse handwritten notes and photocopied documents. The voting irregularities, the sudden rule changes, the way certain families get targeted while others. She trailed off, closing the folder quickly. "I taught Tommy in 7th grade, you know. He was such a sweet boy. Always respectful, always working hard. And watching Karen go after your family like this?" Her voice cracked on the last words, and I could see the moral weight crushing her. Janet Morrison was a woman who'd spent 30 years teaching children about fairness and justice, now trapped in a system that violated everything she'd tried to instill in her students. "I feel complicit," she continued, tears forming in her eyes. "Every board meeting I attend, every decision I don't challenge, I'm letting families get hurt because I'm too scared to rock the boat." The sunset was fading now, casting long shadows across the pond, but Janet's internal struggle was just coming into focus. She'd been keeping evidence, detailed records of Karen's systematic abuse of power, but she lacked the expertise to understand its significance or the courage to act on it alone. "Janet," I said carefully, "what if I told you that your documentation might be exactly what's needed to protect other families from going through what we're facing?" She looked at me with the desperate hope of someone who'd been carrying a terrible burden alone. "You really think... could we actually stop her?" The ducks had settled in for the night, and Karen's house lights were coming on across the pond, but sitting there with Janet Morrison's folder of carefully documented evidence, I felt the first real surge of optimism since this whole nightmare began. I said, looking directly at her. "Because sometimes the most unlikely allies turn out to be exactly who you need." Janet Morrison might have been scared, but she'd been building a case against Karen Whitfield without even realizing it. The retired teacher who felt powerless, had just handed me the keys to Karen's kingdom. The next morning, I was under the Camaro's hood, cleaning the air filter housing, when the rumble of a diesel engine made me look up. A flatbed tow truck was backing into my driveway, and Karen Whitfield stood behind it with her arms crossed, wearing the same smug expression I'd seen on insurance scammers right before I'd exposed their schemes. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, stepping between the truck and my father's car. "Emergency removal of a community safety hazard," Karen announced, pulling out her phone to record. "The HOA has full authority under Covenant Section 12B to remove any vehicle deemed dangerous to residents." The tow truck driver looked uncomfortable as I walked over to him. "Sir, I need to see the legal authorization for this tow," I said, using the calm but authoritative tone that had served me well during fraud investigations. "Ma'am said she had the paperwork," he mumbled, clearly realizing he'd been dragged into something questionable. "Actually, she doesn't," I replied, pulling out my phone. "This is private property, and the HOA has no emergency powers over legally parked vehicles. If you attempt this tow without proper legal authorization, you'll be committing theft, and I'll be filing charges." Karen's face flushed red. "You can't intimidate us with your legal mumbo-jumbo. The board that doesn't have a quorum," I interrupted. "The same board that's been making up rules as it goes along." The tow truck driver was already unhooking his equipment. "Lady, I ain't touching this car without a court order. Y'all figure out your paperwork problems first." As the truck pulled away, Karen stepped closer to me, her mask of suburban civility finally slipping. "You think you're so smart with your fancy investigation background? This community has standards, and people like you either follow them or find somewhere else to live." There it was, the barely concealed bigotry I'd suspected all along. "People like me?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "You know exactly what I mean," she hissed. "This neighborhood was peaceful before your kind started moving in with your loud cars and your diverse lifestyles." The admission was more than I'd hoped for, and I made sure to keep recording on my phone. Karen Whitfield had just confessed to racially motivated harassment, and she was too angry to realize what she'd revealed. What followed over the next 3 days was a campaign of petty harassment that would have been laughable if it wasn't so obviously calculated. Karen appeared in my yard every morning with a tape measure, documenting grass height to the 1/4 inch. She photographed my house from multiple angles, timing when I put out garbage cans and measuring their distance from the curb. On Wednesday, she brought a clipboard and spent an hour walking around my property, taking notes about everything from the angle of my mailbox to the color of my garden hose. The behavior reminded me of insurance investigators building a case, except she was the one committing fraud. "Dad, the crazy lady's back," Tommy said Thursday morning, peeking through the kitchen blinds. Sure enough, Karen was crouched beside our driveway with what looked like a level, apparently measuring the slope of our concrete. The absurdity of it might have been funny if I hadn't recognized the pattern. She was building a documentation file, probably planning to bury us under a mountain of frivolous violations. But her desperation revealed something important. Karen was scared. People who were confident in their authority didn't resort to stalking and harassment. They didn't try illegal towing attempts or spend hours photographing mailbox angles. Karen Whitfield was acting like someone who knew her house of cards was about to collapse. That evening, Lisa found me in the garage staring at the Camaro while Karen continued her surveillance from across the street. "You're planning something," she said, reading my expression with 23 years of marriage experience. "Yeah," I admitted, running my hand along the car's pristine fender. "I'm going to destroy her." Friday afternoon, I met my former colleague Dave Martinez at Brewster's Cafe downtown, needing to clear my head and maybe gain some perspective on Karen's increasingly erratic behavior. Dave had been my partner for 3 years in the state insurance fraud division before I'd gone independent, and he still had the sharp eyes of someone who saw scams everywhere. "You look like hell, Mike," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "What's eating at you?" I explained the HOA situation while Dave stirred his coffee, watching his expression grow more interested as I described Karen's aggressive tactics and systematic targeting of specific families. "Hold up," Dave interrupted when I mentioned Willowbrook Estates. "Your HOA, they've been filing a lot of insurance claims lately." Every alarm bell in my investigator's brain started ringing. "What kind of claims?" property damage mostly, storm damage, vandalism, contractor accidents. But the dollar amounts keep escalating, and they're using the same restoration companies over and over. Dave pulled out his phone and scrolled through some notes. We've been tracking it because the pattern matches organized fraud schemes we've seen in other suburban communities. The familiar rush of a major case breaking open hit me like caffeine straight to the bloodstream. Same contractors, escalating costs, mysterious timing. Exactly. And here's the kicker. Most of the damage reports come from one board member who seems to have a real talent for spotting problems that require expensive repairs. Dave leaned forward, his investigator instincts fully engaged. The claims started small 3 years ago, but now we're looking at $20,000, $30,000 payouts for things like community center water damage and playground equipment vandalism. I felt pieces clicking into place in my head. Dave, what's the name on those damage reports? Let me check. He scrolled through his phone. Karen Whitfield. She's been the primary contact on about 80% of the claims. My coffee went cold as the full scope of Karen's operation became clear. She wasn't just running some petty power trip or racist harassment campaign. She was operating a sophisticated insurance fraud scheme, using her HOA position to generate fake damage claims and pocket the payouts. The restoration companies she uses, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I bet if we dig deeper, we'll find some interesting financial connections. Dave nodded grimly. Already started looking. 3 different companies, but they all share the same business address and phone answering service. Classic shell game setup. Walking back to my car after our meeting, I felt the familiar thrill of a complex fraud case unraveling in my hands. But this time, it was personal. Karen hadn't just been targeting families she wanted gone. She'd been systematically stealing from the entire community through fraudulent insurance claims, then using her position of power to silence anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. The harassment campaign against my family suddenly made perfect sense. Karen couldn't afford to have someone with my background poking around an HOA business, asking questions about financial decisions, or examining the board's voting patterns too closely. She'd tried to force us out before I could discover what she was really up to. But she'd made one critical mistake in her calculated scheme. Instead of staying under the radar, her aggressive tactics had drawn the attention of exactly the wrong person. Someone with the skills, experience, and professional connections to expose her entire operation. I pulled out my phone and called Janet Morrison. Janet, it's Mike Chen. Remember that folder of documentation you mentioned? I think it's time we had a more detailed conversation about what you've been observing. Monday morning found me in the sterile HOA administrative office, surrounded by Karen's collection of self-congratulatory plaques and community leadership awards, reviewing the official community guidelines while she worked at her desk. The irony of a fraud artist surrounded by civic achievement certificates wasn't lost on me as I flipped through pages of rules she'd been selectively enforcing. Finding everything you need? Karen asked with false sweetness, clearly annoyed by my presence in her domain. Actually, I'm curious about the insurance claim procedures, I said, watching her body language carefully. Seems like we've had quite a few expensive repairs lately. Her pen stopped moving across the paperwork, and I caught the telltale micro-expression of someone whose guard had just snapped up. Insurance matters are board business, not general community concerns. Funny thing about that, I continued, keeping my voice conversational while my investigator instincts cataloged every tell. I used to work insurance fraud for the state, and our claim frequency is unusual for a community this size. Karen's face went pale, then flushed red as she realized I wasn't just some random homeowner she could intimidate. Your background doesn't give you authority to question legitimate HOA business. I set down the guidelines and looked directly at her. Karen, I know about the shell companies, I know about the inflated damage reports, and I know about your upcoming city council campaign. The last part hit her like a physical blow. She stood up so quickly her chair rolled backward into the wall, her carefully maintained composure cracking like cheap veneer. You don't know anything, she snapped. And even if you think you do, nobody's going to believe some troublemaker who can't even follow simple vehicle restrictions. But it was too late. She had already confirmed my suspicions with her reaction. The woman who'd spent weeks harassing my family over a classic car was running for city council while simultaneously stealing from our community through insurance fraud. Actually, they will believe me, I said, standing up to leave. Because unlike your operation, I have evidence, professional credibility, and contacts at the state insurance fraud division who've been tracking your activities. Karen's mask slipped completely. This neighborhood was perfect before people like you started moving in. We had standards, we had order, and we had residents who understood their place. The racist undertones she'd been barely concealing finally erupted into open bigotry, and I made sure my phone was recording every word. You think your little investigation scares me? She continued, her voice rising to a near shriek. I've been building this community's reputation for years, and I'm not going to let some uppity fraud investigator and his project car destroy everything I've worked for. Standing in that office, surrounded by her fraudulent awards and listening to her spew the hatred she'd been hiding behind suburban civility, I made the decision that would define the next phase of this war. Karen Whitfield wasn't just a petty HOA tyrant. She was a criminal who'd been using racism and intimidation to cover up systematic theft from our entire community. Here's what's going to happen, Karen, I said, my voice carrying the cold authority I'd used when confronting insurance scammers. I'm going to use every skill I learned investigating fraud to expose your entire operation. The fake damage claims, the shell companies, the kickback schemes, all of it. Her face went white as she realized the full scope of what I knew. And when I'm done, I continued, you won't just lose your HOA position and your city council dreams. You'll be facing federal charges for wire fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Walking out of that sterile office, past her wall of fake achievements, I felt the familiar satisfaction of a predator becoming prey. Karen Whitfield had spent 3 years stealing from our community while terrorizing families she deemed unworthy of Willowbrook Estates. But she'd made the fatal mistake of targeting someone with the exact skills needed to destroy her completely. That evening, Janet Morrison called me with a trembling voice, asking if I could come over after the monthly board meeting. There are things you need to see, she whispered into the phone. Things I've been keeping because I knew this day would come. I found her waiting by her front door, glancing nervously up and down the street, before ushering me through her modest colonial home toward the kitchen. The familiar scent of chamomile tea and old books reminded me of visiting my elementary school teachers, but Janet's hands were shaking as she led me to her breakfast nook. I've been documenting everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For 3 years, I've been taking notes, making copies, keeping records of decisions that felt wrong in my gut. She disappeared into her garage and returned struggling with 3 banker's boxes, their weight clearly taxing her 70-year-old frame. I helped her set them on the kitchen table, and when she opened the first box, I saw the meticulous organization of someone who'd spent 30 years managing classroom records. After tonight's meeting, I can't stay silent anymore, Janet said, tears forming in her eyes. Karen announced her city council campaign right there in front of the whole board, talking about expanding her community improvement model to the entire district. The thought of her gaining more power. Her voice trailed off as she pulled out a thick folder labeled Financial Irregularities 2021-2024. Inside were photocopied bank statements, contractor invoices, and insurance claim forms, all organized by date with Janet's careful handwritten notes in the margins. I'm just a retired English teacher, she confessed, wiping her eyes with a tissue. I don't understand the accounting details, but I knew something was wrong when the same 3 contractors kept getting selected for increasingly expensive repairs. I opened the folder and immediately recognized the pattern Dave Martinez had described. Damage reports filed by Karen, followed by inflated repair estimates from the same rotating group of companies, then insurance claims that far exceeded typical community maintenance costs. Janet, this is incredible work, I said, scanning through her detailed notes. You've documented every step of what appears to be a sophisticated fraud operation. She pulled out another folder, this one labeled Voting Irregularities. Inside were meeting minutes showing how Karen had been, manipulating board votes by scheduling meetings when certain members couldn't attend, or calling emergency sessions with minimal notice. The worst part is the targeting, Janet said, producing a third folder marked selective enforcement. I started noticing how certain families got violation notices while others doing the exact same things were ignored. So, I began documenting the patterns. The folder contained photographs, addresses, and detailed notes about which families had been targeted versus which had been protected. Janet had unknowingly compiled a comprehensive record of Karen's discriminatory enforcement practices. "Why didn't you speak up during the meetings?" I asked gently. Janet's shoulders sagged. "Because I was scared. Karen has this way of making you feel like questioning her judgment makes you disloyal to the community. And she's so confident in her authority that you start doubting your own perceptions." She opened the second banker's box, revealing more financial records and what appeared to be correspondence between Karen and various contractors. "But after watching her target your family, seeing Tommy's face when she threatened to take away his grandfather's car, I couldn't pretend anymore that this was just aggressive management." The third box contained Janet's personal journals, where she'd recorded her observations and growing concerns about Karen's behavior over the past 3 years. The entries read like a psychological study of how a corrupt leader gradually normalizes abuse of power. "I've been carrying this burden alone for so long," Janet whispered. "Every board meeting where I stayed silent, every decision I didn't challenge, I felt like I was betraying everything I tried to teach my students about standing up for what's right." Looking at the mountain of evidence Janet had carefully preserved, I felt a surge of respect for this quiet woman who'd been conducting her own investigation while struggling with her conscience. She'd documented Karen's crimes with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd once used to track her students' progress. "Janet, you haven't betrayed anything," I said firmly. "You've been building the case that's going to stop Karen from hurting anyone else. This documentation is exactly what I need to expose her fraud operation to the authorities." Her face brightened with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. "You really think we can stop her?" I said, looking at the evidence spread across her kitchen table. "Because sometimes the quiet heroes turn out to be the ones who save the day." Janet Morrison had spent 3 years feeling powerless while secretly building the most comprehensive case file I'd ever seen. The retired teacher who thought she didn't understand accounting had just handed me everything I needed to destroy Karen Whitfield's criminal empire. Back in my home office, I spread Janet's 3 boxes of documentation across every available surface, my desk, the filing cabinets, even the floor, creating a command center that looked like something from my old fraud investigation days. The familiar process of organizing evidence into chronological patterns brought back the methodical satisfaction I'd missed since going independent. I started with Janet's financial records, cross-referencing her notes with the contractor invoices and insurance claims. Within an hour, the fraud scheme's architecture became crystal clear. Karen had been operating a sophisticated shell game, using her property management company, Willowbrook Property Solutions, as the central hub for laundering fraudulent transactions. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Karen would file damage reports for community property, storm damage to the gazebo, vandalism at the playground, water damage in the community center. Then her 3 independent contractors would submit repair estimates that were consistently 3 to 4 times higher than industry standards for similar work. But here's where it got interesting. The contractors were all registered to the same business address as Karen's property management company. Same phone number, same answering service, even the same business license application date. Karen hadn't just been inflating repair costs. She'd been paying herself through fake companies to fix damage that often didn't exist. I pulled out my laptop and began building a comprehensive financial analysis spreadsheet, the same type I'd used to prosecute million-dollar insurance scams. Each fraudulent transaction got its own ROW, with columns for the reported damage, estimated repair cost, actual insurance payout, and the contractor involved. The numbers were staggering. Over 3 years, Karen had successfully claimed $247,000 in fraudulent insurance payouts. But the real genius of her scheme was how she'd used selective HOA enforcement to silence potential whistleblowers. Families who might have questioned the constant emergency repairs or noticed the same contractors always getting selected had been systematically driven from the community through harassment and frivolous violations. Janet's meeting minutes revealed another layer of the operation. Karen had been manipulating board votes by scheduling emergency meetings when questioning members couldn't attend, or by calling votes on complex financial matters without providing adequate review time. She'd essentially turned the HOA board into a rubber stamp for her criminal enterprise. I cross-referenced the insurance claims with weather data from the National Weather Service. 3 of Karen's storm damage claims had been filed during weeks with zero precipitation and wind speeds under 10 miles per hour. The vandalism at the playground had supposedly occurred during a period when security cameras were temporarily malfunctioning, cameras that had somehow never been repaired despite multiple insurance payouts for their replacement. But the smoking gun was in Janet's personal journal entries. She'd documented a conversation where Karen had bragged about her community improvement strategies and how certain types of residents created maintenance challenges that required creative solutions. The implication was clear. Karen had been using manufactured crises to justify her fraud, while simultaneously using racist harassment to control community demographics. By midnight, I had constructed an airtight case that would satisfy any prosecutor. Karen's scheme bore all the hallmarks of organized fraud: systematic documentation, falsification, coordinated contractor conspiracies, insurance claim inflation, and witness intimidation through selective enforcement. The methodical process of building the case reminded me why I'd loved fraud investigation. There was something deeply satisfying about taking scattered pieces of suspicious activity and weaving them into an unshakable narrative of criminal behavior. Karen had thought she was smart enough to steal from an entire community while hiding behind suburban respectability. But she'd been documenting her own crimes with the same meticulous attention to detail that would now destroy her. I leaned back in my office chair, surrounded by evidence of Karen's 3-year criminal enterprise, and felt the familiar surge of confidence that comes from having an untouchable case. Tomorrow, I'd start the process of coordinating with Dave Martinez and the insurance fraud division to ensure Karen faced the full consequences of her crimes. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The woman who'd threatened my father's legacy and terrorized my family had no idea that her perfectly organized fraud operation was about to become her perfectly documented conviction. The next morning, I began the systematic process of gathering corroborating evidence to support Janet's documentation. My first stop was interviewing contractors who'd been passed over for HOA work, using my investigative background to ask the right questions without revealing my full purpose. Mike Torres from Torres Construction had been excluded from HOA bidding for 2 years, despite being the lowest bidder on multiple projects. It was always the same story, he told me in his cluttered office trailer. My estimates would come in 30% lower than the chosen contractor, but Karen would find some technicality to disqualify my bid. Quality concerns, scheduling conflicts, insurance issues that never made sense. His record showed a pattern of arbitrary rejection, despite his company having better credentials and references than Karen's chosen contractors. More importantly, Mike had kept copies of his rejected bids, which clearly demonstrated the massive inflation in Karen's approved contracts. Next, I drove through the neighborhood, photographing Karen's property management vehicles at job sites that supposedly didn't exist. Using the GPS coordinates from insurance claim forms, I documented that Willowbrook Property Solutions trucks were regularly parked at residential addresses with no visible signs of the emergency repairs they'd been paid to perform. The surveillance work felt like old times, except now I was hunting someone who'd made it personal. At the third location, a house where Karen had supposedly repaired extensive storm damage, I found her nephew Danny Whitfield pressure washing a perfectly intact fence. When I casually asked what repairs were being done, he looked confused and said he was just doing routine maintenance for his aunt's property management business. That afternoon, I coordinated with Dave Martinez to ensure the state insurance fraud division was prepared to act on my findings. "Mike, this is bigger than we initially thought," he said over the phone. "We've been tracking similar schemes in 3 other suburban communities, and they all involved the same network of shell companies Karen's been using. The revelation that Karen was part of a broader fraud network added federal conspiracy charges to the growing list of crimes I could prove. The woman who'd harassed my family over a classic car was apparently running a regional insurance fraud operation that had stolen millions from suburban communities across the state. I spent the evening conducting discreet interviews with neighbors who'd been affected by Karen's various emergency repairs. Mrs. Patterson from Oak Street described how contractors had supposedly repaired extensive water damage to the community center while she was volunteering there, except she'd never seen any evidence of water damage or repair work. I thought it was strange, she admitted, but Karen said the insurance company required immediate action, and she handled all the paperwork herself. We trusted her expertise. That trust had cost the community nearly $250,000 in fraudulent claims, while Karen had simultaneously been terrorizing families like mine to prevent anyone from asking uncomfortable questions about her financial management. Each interview added another layer to the case, but more importantly, it revealed how Karen had systematically manipulated community trust to enable her crimes. She'd positioned herself as the indispensable expert who handled all the complicated insurance and contractor relationships, discouraging other board members from reviewing details or asking questions. By Friday evening, I had transformed from a defensive homeowner fighting an HOA violation into a federal prosecutor armed with irrefutable evidence of systematic fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The methodical preparation process reminded me why I'd excelled at fraud investigation, the satisfaction of building a case so comprehensive that denial became impossible. But the real breakthrough came when I discovered that Karen had been using the same selective enforcement tactics in her previous HOA position before moving to Willowbrook Estates. Her pattern of targeting minority families while protecting her allies wasn't just local corruption. It was a systematic approach she'd refined over years of practice. Standing in my driveway that evening, polishing my father's Camaro, while Karen continued her daily surveillance from across the street, I felt the quiet confidence of a predator who'd successfully surrounded his prey. She had no idea that her own meticulous record-keeping and systematic approach to fraud had provided exactly the evidence needed to destroy her completely. The retired insurance investigator she'd tried to intimidate had just finished building the most comprehensive fraud case of his career. Monday morning found me in the Willowbrook Estates Community Center, arranging folding chairs in precise rows, while mentally preparing for what would either be Karen's public destruction or her most desperate attempt to maintain control. I'd requested this special board meeting under the innocuous pretense of discussing community vehicle policies, knowing that Karen's arrogance would compel her to attend and defend her actions publicly. The community center's bland beige walls and fluorescent lighting created the perfect setting for bureaucratic theater. But I was staging something far more consequential than a typical HOA meeting. I'd spent the morning coordinating final details with Dave Martinez and his team from the State Insurance Fraud Division, who would be observing from the back rows as concerned residents. Remember, we need her to make statements about her authority and decision-making process, Dave had reminded me during our final phone briefing. The more she talks about controlling community standards and managing insurance claims, the stronger our case becomes. I'd also ensured that local media received invitations framed as a community rights story about HOA overreach and selective enforcement. Channel 7's community reporter, Jessica Walsh, had seemed particularly interested when I mentioned potential discrimination issues and financial irregularities affecting multiple families. Janet Morrison arrived early, her face pale but determined, as she helped me arrange the additional chairs we'd need for what I hoped would be a standing room-only crowd. "I've been awake all night thinking about this," she confessed, her teacher's instincts clearly warring with her fear of confrontation. "Janet, you've already done the hardest part," I assured her, testing the microphone system. "Your documentation made this possible. Now, we just need to let Karen be herself." The affected families began arriving around 6:30. The Rodriguez family, the Patels, the Johnsons, and several others who'd been driven from the community by Karen's harassment campaigns. Seeing them together in one room, I was struck by the diversity that Karen had found so threatening to her vision of suburban homogeneity. Tommy arrived with Lisa, both of them understanding that tonight wasn't just about keeping the Camaro. It was about preventing Karen from expanding her corrupt authority to the city council level. "Dad, are you nervous?" Tommy asked, adjusting his tie like he was attending something formal and important. "Actually, I'm excited," I admitted, feeling the familiar pre-confrontation energy I remembered from major fraud prosecutions. "Your grandfather always taught me that bullies only win when good people stay silent." Karen arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, flanked by her 2 remaining loyal board members and carrying a thick folder of what I assume were retaliatory violations she planned to unleash if the meeting didn't go her way. She surveyed the unusually large crowd with obvious suspicion, her political instincts clearly sensing that something was different about tonight's gathering. "I see we have some unexpected guests," she announced, taking her position at the front table. "I hope everyone understands that HOA meetings are for residents only, and we don't allow outside agitators to disrupt our community business." The comment was perfect, immediately establishing her authoritarian tone, while dismissing legitimate community concerns as outside agitation. I caught Dave Martinez's slight nod from the back row, confirming that Karen was already providing exactly the type of statements that would support our case. Jessica Walsh from Channel 7 had positioned herself strategically with her cameraman, and I noticed several residents discreetly recording with their phones. Karen's every word and gesture would be preserved for posterity, creating a permanent record of her public downfall. "Actually, Karen," I said, standing up from my seat in the front row, "I think you'll find that everyone here tonight is deeply concerned about our community's future, especially regarding certain financial irregularities and enforcement patterns that deserve public discussion." Her face went white, then flushed red as she realized this wasn't going to be the typical rubber stamp meeting she'd orchestrated for 3 years. The trap was set, the evidence was overwhelming, and Karen Whitfield was about to discover what happens when someone with federal fraud investigation experience decides to fight back. The only question remaining was whether she'd try to bluff her way through the evidence or completely melt down under pressure. Based on her behavior over the past weeks, I was betting on a spectacular public collapse that would make prosecuting her even easier. The packed community center fell into absolute silence as I stood up, folder in hand, and walked to the front of the room where Karen sat behind her makeshift board table. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face as she realized this wasn't going to be another of her carefully orchestrated rubber stamp meetings. "Karen, before we discuss vehicle policies, I think the community deserves to understand some irregularities in our HOA's financial management," I began, my voice carrying the calm authority I'd perfected during fraud prosecutions. Specifically, the $247,000 in questionable insurance claims filed over the past 3 years. Her face went white, then flushed crimson as murmurs rippled through the crowd. "You have no authority to question legitimate board business," she snapped, but her voice cracked on the word legitimate. I opened Janet's folder and pulled out the first exhibit, a contractor invoice for $35,000 to repair extensive storm damage to the community gazebo. This claim was filed during a week with 0 precipitation and wind speeds under 10 miles per hour, I announced, holding up the corresponding weather data. "The contractor listed is registered to the same business address as your property management company." The room erupted in shocked whispers as residents began connecting dots they'd never been allowed to see. Karen's 2 loyal board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly hearing this information for the first time. "Furthermore," I continued, pulling out photograph after photograph, "I've documented your property management vehicles at supposed repair sites where no work was being performed. Your nephew Danny confirmed he was doing routine maintenance, not the emergency repairs your insurance claims described." "This is harassment," Karen shrieked, standing up so quickly her chair toppled backward. "You're trying to destroy this community because you can't follow simple rules about appropriate vehicles." The desperation in her voice only made my case stronger. I pulled out Janet's meeting minutes, showing the voting irregularities, the selective enforcement documentation, and the financial records proving systematic fraud. "Actually, Karen, let's talk about selective enforcement," I said, gesturing toward the crowd. "Mrs. Rodriguez, would you please tell everyone about your family's experience with the work truck violation?" Maria Rodriguez stood up, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. Karen forced us to sell our home because of a truck that had been parked in our driveway for 8 years without complaint. But the Williams family still has their boat trailer that clearly violates the same restrictions. One by one, the targeted families shared their stories, while Karen's face grew paler with each testimony. The Patels described their garden statue violation, the Johnsons explained the motorcycle harassment, and other residents revealed violations they'd received for infractions that Karen's allies committed without consequence. That's when Dave Martinez stood up from the back row, displaying his State Insurance Fraud Division badge. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dave Martinez with the State Insurance Fraud Division. Based on evidence provided by Mr. Chen, we're opening a formal investigation into fraudulent insurance claims filed by this HOA. The room exploded with shocked gasps and angry murmurs as residents realized the scope of Karen's crimes. She backed against the wall like a cornered animal, her carefully constructed facade crumbling in real time. "We've identified multiple shell companies used to inflate repair costs," Dave continued, along with evidence of systematic insurance fraud totaling nearly $250,000 stolen from this community. "This is a witch hunt!" Karen screamed, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "You people don't understand what I've sacrificed to maintain property values in this neighborhood. I've protected this community from people who don't appreciate what we've built here." Her racist undertones became explicit as she completely lost control. "These ungrateful residents want to turn Willowbrook Estates into some kind of diversity experiment. My standards kept this place respectable." Jessica Walsh from Channel 7 captured every word as Karen's 3-year campaign of theft and harassment collapsed into a public meltdown that would lead the evening news. The woman who'd terrorized families and stolen community funds was revealing her true character for all to see. Janet Morrison stood up, tears streaming down her face, and announced her motion to remove Karen from the board, effective immediately. The vote was unanimous among the legitimate board members, with only Karen's 2 remaining allies abstaining. As Dave Martinez began reading Karen her rights, I felt the satisfaction of a case perfectly executed. The woman who'd tried to destroy my family's legacy had just destroyed herself with her own greed and hatred. The insurance investigator she'd underestimated had delivered exactly the justice she deserved. 6 months later, I stood beside my father's gleaming 1969 Camaro SS in the middle of Willowbrook Estates' main boulevard, watching our first annual classic car show transform what had once been a battleground into a celebration of community resilience. The street was lined with restored muscle cars, vintage imports, and family treasures that would have triggered Karen's discriminatory enforcement just months earlier. Tommy was in his element, explaining carburetor rebuild techniques to a group of fascinated middle schoolers, while Earl Thompson shared stories about the cars he'd worked on during his Army service. The sight of my son confidently teaching others about his grandfather's restoration work filled me with the kind of pride that transcends any HOA victory. "Hard to believe it's the same neighborhood," Lisa said, joining me with 2 cups of coffee as we watched the Martinez family's lowrider bounce hydraulically to the delight of gathered children. "Remember when Maria thought she'd never feel safe in Willowbrook again?" The transformation had been remarkable. After Karen's arrest on federal charges of wire fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations, the community had experienced something like collective therapy. Families who'd been terrorized into silence finally felt safe sharing their stories, and the patterns of systematic discrimination became impossible to ignore. Janet Morrison had been elected as our new HOA president by the largest voter turnout in community history, running on a platform of transparency, fairness, and actual community building rather than exclusion. Her first act had been establishing the Willowbrook Welcome Committee to actively support new families rather than intimidate them into conformity. The federal prosecutors said Karen's plea deal includes restitution for all affected families, I told Lisa, watching the Patel grandchildren play around their family's restored garden statues, now prominently displayed in the community center courtyard. Plus, she's facing 5 to 7 years in federal prison. But the real victory wasn't Karen's downfall. It was what our community had become in her absence. The fear and suspicion she'd cultivated had been replaced by genuine neighborly connection. The Johnsons had organized a motorcycle safety course for teenagers. The Rodriguez family had returned to Willowbrook, with Carlos now serving as the HOA's preferred contractor for legitimate maintenance projects. "Dad, check this out," Tommy called, gesturing toward a pristine 1967 Mustang that had just pulled up. Mrs. Chen from Maple Street restored this herself after her husband passed. She said Grandpa's car inspired her to finish the project. The ripple effects of our victory continued spreading through the community in ways I'd never anticipated. Our battle against Karen's corruption had become a symbol of what was possible when people with different skills and backgrounds worked together against injustice. Dave Martinez appeared beside me, no longer wearing his official investigator badge, but clearly enjoying the celebration. "Mike, I wanted you to know that Karen's case helped us identify the broader fraud network she was part of. We've recovered over $2 million stolen from suburban communities across 3 states. The scope of what we'd uncovered still amazed me. What had started as a fight to keep my father's car had exposed a regional conspiracy that had been systematically stealing from working families while using racist intimidation to silence potential whistleblowers. The insurance companies are using your documentation methods as a training model," Dave continued. "You might have just revolutionized how we investigate HOA fraud cases." As the afternoon sun caught the Camaro's chrome, I thought about my father's final years spent restoring this car in his garage, probably never imagining it would become the catalyst for exposing systematic corruption and rebuilding an entire community's spirit. Tommy approached with a group of his friends, all admiring the engine bay that had started this whole journey. "Dad, can you tell them about how you took down Karen Whitfield? They don't believe me when I say my dad's like a detective." Looking at their eager faces, I realized this story would become part of Willowbrook's history, proof that ordinary people with specialized skills could fight back against corruption and win. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from, I said, addressing the broader community that had supported our fight. The classic car show continued around us, but I knew we'd created something more valuable than any community event. We'd proven that sometimes protecting what matters most requires using every skill you possess to fight for justice. My father's legacy lived on, not just in the restored Camaro, but in a community that had learned to value diversity, transparency, and the courage to stand up to those who abuse their power.